Well, we've been going through that section of Matthew where Jesus sat on the mountain and his disciples came, and he very much fulfills this prophecy as the second Moses, the fulfillment of the expectations of Moses when he said, there will become a prophet eventually who you will listen to. And as they sit and they listen to him, Jesus unfolds the terms of his new covenant. And he describes the ethics of this kingdom, what it is to be part of his administration, his kingdom, his world order, if you will. And as we come into this, of course, we now tackle that part where he gives his commandments. And for those of us, especially myself, who grew up Sabbatarian, it's very much tied to the idea that when Jesus is sort of privileged to come along and to expand on that which Moses gave. And you certainly can't go outside of the guidelines that Moses gave, but this is a problem because Jesus seems to reverse a few things. And he seems to sort of play with a few things. And what exactly is he doing here? I remember some years ago now, going all the way back to when I was a freshman in college, the dean of students was a tall, imposing individual by the name of Ron. And he was our club director as well. And he was an imposing man. You didn't cross Ron, and or as he was known as, well, I won't give his last name. But he'd been in the military, and he was a dignified man of strength, and he had a mind like a steel trap. And one of the most terrifying experiences of my life was to give a heckle speech, which is one of those assignments where you have to speak, but everybody's allowed to heckle you. And I'll never forget Ron Dart heckling me. Oh, there you go. Give his last name. Anyway. Clearly, I don't have a mind like a steel trap. Anyway, for many reasons, I respected him and enjoyed him, but you'd never cross him. But some years later, I remember listening to him because he then went on and he had a radio ministry in the United States, and listening to him as he laid forth. And as I said, this man who was skilled in debate, and you never crossed him. You never won an argument with him. And he was the authority figure. But I never forget the day he declared, who in their right mind would want to change a law as beautiful as the one that says, thou shalt not kill? And after just a moment's reflection, I said, hey, I would. Fortunately, I was listening to a radio broadcast, and I didn't have to look him in the eye and debate. All right? But that's when I realized, hey, maybe I've grown up a little bit, and I wouldn't be afraid to tackle this particular point. Because here we have Jesus establishing the terms of a new covenant. And the covenant is likened to a marriage. And of course, our covenant with Jesus is also likened to a marriage, which is why the church is called the bride of Christ. And so as you look back, you ask, well, what were the terms of the old covenant? Because some arguments go that the law is not the covenant is not the law, which is kind of silly. It's like saying the marriage is not the vows, and the vows are not the marriage. The definition of the covenant of marriage is the vows that you take. And if you try operating a marriage without operating on the basis of the laws or the vows that you've given and the commitments that you've given, you'll see how far you get before crockery starts to fly and other problems ensue. And so when you look at the Ten Commandments, you realize these are the terms of the Old Covenant. And the Old Covenant begins with, this is the heart and core of it. And Jesus is now introducing a new deal, a new covenant. And it sounds very similar, but it is not the same. And in a minute, we'll see how. But there is still a direct connection. And Jesus begins with this rather challenging little bit of discussion when he says in Matthew 5 and verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. At which point you pause and say, well, what does it mean to fulfill? Some interpretations would be to fill to the full, to embellish on them. As I say, this idea then that Moses is the authority and Jesus has the privilege of sort of fleshing out the details or adding a little bit and embellishing upon what Moses gave. But that doesn't feel right either, because after all, Moses was the mediator of a covenant. Jesus is the mediator of another covenant, but he's God. Shouldn't he sort of outrank the first Moses? And wow, that's a bit of a conundrum. On the other hand, Jesus said, I truly tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished, or the purpose is fulfilled. Some would say, well, that means he kept the law for you and you don't have to worry about anything. Well, that doesn't sound right. I don't have to be sort of held responsible to anything here. What are we saying? Then he goes on to add, for I'll tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. You won't be part of my kingdom unless you can offer up something better than those who keep the law just about perfectly. Because for all you could say about the Pharisees, and Jesus had a lot to say, they did keep the law. In fact, he complimented them in some ways. He said, you pay tithe of all the small seeds. Good for you. This ought you to have done. Paul, though, sort of helps us by giving us a very clear answer when it comes to this understanding of, well, what was the point of all of that went before? What was the point of the law, the Old Covenant? And in the book of Romans, chapter 10 and verse 3, and I hope this little summary sort of nails it for you here. He says, of his countryfolk. And remember, he was a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. He'd studied at the feet of Gamaliel. He and his buddy Barnabas were fellow students. And they, in fact, Barnabas is a Levite, and he really knows the law. He really knows what it means to be a priest. And so Paul is saying here, look, as one who has grown up and kept the law without, blamelessly, he says, of his fellow countrymen, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they made a mistake. They did not submit to God's righteousness. Or the righteousness, what does it mean? It means to be right. It means to be aligned. It means to be sort of lined up correctly. Since they did not know that to be lined up with God was more than just being lined up with a bunch of rules and regulations, they lost the point. And of course, the point he's making is that they rejected the Christ. They thought that we don't need him. We're descendants of Abraham, and we keep the law. Therefore, if I do, then I am. That was their approach. If I do certain things, then I am right. Well, apparently not. And he goes on to add, Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be rightness for everyone who believes in him. That Greek word can be a little confusing, perhaps. What do you mean he's the culmination of the law? The Greek word is telos. It means simply the point aimed at, the goal, where we were going. In other analogies, Paul will use the expression, one is a shadow, but Jesus is the reality. Oh, what you're saying is this was just a precursor to the real thing. Just as Moses said, I am one who goes first, but there will come after me a prophet that you will listen to, and he'll get the job done, because clearly we're not. Oh, that's what you mean. Somehow or other that went before is sort of leading towards something that is the ultimate expression of God, what God really wants. And what God really wants is to make everyone, quote, right with him. But to be right with him, you have to believe in the one who he has sent. You have to believe in him, Jesus the Christ. All analogies break down. But I'll reach into my own sad experience from years gone by and try and offer an analogy. Because once upon a time, I built something. And as I was building it, I found out all about financing. You know about financing. You financed your farm, you got a mortgage. You financed your house, you got a mortgage. Things like that. And so I had sought the advice from 4 different counselors at my local branch. And they all said, what you're doing is the right thing. What you're doing is the right thing. So I went ahead and did what I thought was the right thing. And it reached a certain point, I had to go back and take them up on their promise. And they went through all the paperwork and did the evaluations and all that stuff. And they said, oh, yeah, you're such a good guy, Bob. Yes, I am. And then there was silence. And I anticipated getting mortgage money at 4%. And finally, after some lull in the discussion, I got the word, well, we're going to get you an answer this afternoon. So an answer came back because the answer has to come from Toronto now. Not that I have anything against the East, but don't get me started. And so the answer came back from Toronto, and it was, no, we're not doing that. So what went wrong? I talked to 4 of you guys. I did exactly what you said. You went after all the right things. You did all the right things. And somebody actually offered the explanation, well, yeah, the bank never actually does this. What? Now I'm hung out, but don't worry. We'll put you in the hands of a mortgage broker. I didn't realize at the time, but what they were saying is, don't worry, we can't help you, but the mafia is always available. Okay. So I was thinking 4% at the time. And they put me in the hands of a mortgage broker, shopped it around, and came back and said, well, there are a couple of people who are interested in you at 20%. Huh? Finally, found me somebody who said, yeah, we'd be happy to loan you money at 16% for 1 year. And, of course, at the end of the year, you've got to go through the rigmarole again, pay legal fees and everything else. And, oh, man, this is horrible. This is not what I anticipated. And there are all sorts of problems and difficulties associated with this. There are all sorts of scary things happening. But I did it. And they signed me up at 16% for 1 year. At the end of the year, of course, things were very, very different. And I went back to my bank. And by now, I had learned some bitter lessons. And so I went in and I said, I'm not interested in being a nice guy. I just want you to know that I'm going to go to everybody I can. Just because, I'm here doesn't mean to say I love you. In fact, I am kind of bitter about what the experience. You let me down badly. And the person on the other side of the desk said, we don't care. We're the bank. We don't have to care. And then they said to me, but this week we have a special on, and we can offer mortgage money just for this week at 2.5%. So all my anger, all my pushback went, okay, we'll talk. And I became humble. And we very gently went through my entire life, and they rearranged things. And I went, and you imagine this, you're paying $16 for every $100 you borrow, and now you're paying $2.50. A lot of difference. And so I was no longer with the Gouge and Screw Mortgage Corporation of Kelowna, BC, which I've been dealing with. I was now with the beloved Scotiabank, where I had my Visa card. I had moved from one covenant, which really was sucking me dry, to another one, which was totally different. In fact, you'll find out that there are companies like the Gouge and Screw Mortgage Company of Kelowna, which I've been dealing with, that are in fact predatory. And I know several people have done this in perhaps reverse mortgage situations, or just thought for a couple of years they took things at high mortgage rate, and they discover that they can't quite get out of it. And those mortgage companies, they are predatory. If you're so desperate you need us, then we're going to sign you up and we'll do whatever you need, but we're pretty sure that you won't make it. And when you won't make it, then we will end up owning your property. There's a little bit of this in reverse mortgages, and some elderly people have suffered that fate. You have to handle those with kid gloves. And so I went from the experience of being in a mortgage situation where it had to be done in a transition period, where they hoped for my failure. Why do they hope for my failure? Because then they could claim my soul, and they could have me, and they could just pillage as far as they were concerned. But of course they did it with a smile, so it was okay. That's the nature of venture capital. That's the nature, in fact, you sometimes hear this said of people. That's one of the criticisms of Mitt Romney. He was a nice guy, but he worked for Bain Capital, and the purpose of Bain Capital was to just go out and scoop up businesses that were in trouble, split them up, maximize the profits, and then that's kind of a predatory thing. You just go a few blocks from here, payday loan. They'll be happy to do that. They'll give you a $200 loan real quick for $20. That's 10%. You know, you don't think of it, but 10% for a 1-week loan? Really? You know, 10% for a year maybe, but 10% for a week? Wow. And of course people discover, and I've been involved with a number of people who've just handed over the title to their car. And they discover, well, I guess that covenant wasn't too healthy for me because now I don't have a car. And so here I was, but even though I moved from a predatory mortgage company to a bank, and I reduced my liabilities by a huge amount, I still had a covenant. I moved from one to the other. And when I moved from one predatory company that wanted my life to a bank that really, they claim anyway, and their business model is far different. They claim they don't want your property. A bank is not interested in repossessing your property, which is why they'll only loan you maybe 60 or 70 or at most 80% on a piece of property, because they don't want it back. Especially if the value of property has any chance of going down, which in Alberta it has quite dramatically over the last 10 years for a lot of people. The bank isn't interested in owning a whole bunch of properties. They just want to do business in a clear and simple way so that they get money and they can do things. Now, a predatory company can say, well, we'll loan you 110% on that. Or no, they wouldn't do that. They probably only loan you about 50%, but you're desperate, so they'll loan it at 16%, things like that. And but they kind of hope that you fail, and then they'll scoop it in, sell it off for more than perhaps is owed against it, and they'll do fine. Thank you very much. A bank will advertise and say, we're in the business of wanting you to pay off your property actually a little sooner, not later. And they will say that their practice is to see that they can move you to actually 100% ownership as in a reasonably good period of time. But after you look at all of that, you still have obligations. But you've moved from one covenant with a predatory company that doesn't mind if you die, in fact, kind of likes it if you die, to, and I don't want to give the banks too much credit, that will kind of help you and advise you as to how to move towards financial life and ownership. You still, though, have a mortgage. And when you speak of the old covenant and the new covenant, Paul doesn't say, now that you are no longer bound by the law of Moses, that you are free and clear and everything else. He says, no, you are actually, if you will, owned by a different company. You are bound by a different covenant. In fact, he encourages us to think of what? Think of yourself as the bond slave now, not of Egypt, but of Christ. Why? Because Egypt was interested in sucking the life out of you. The old covenant was interested in simply giving you very limited benefits, and at the end of that came death. But Jesus is interested in giving you life. As I said, all analogies break down, and some of you are saying, I really can't equate Jesus to a sort of a warm-hearted bank. Analogies break down. But for me, that's the difference. But I still have mortgage. I still have obligations. And the obligation that Jesus gives is, look, you think this through, your righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees. Your sense of responsibility has to exceed that, now that you've come over here, to this different organization. And Jesus is asking you to consider. And when you talk about law, you go a little bit more deeply, because you look back at the concept of, let's say, the adversary, the devil. And you go all the way back to the beginning. The first references to Satan are, in fact, in a legal context. You think of it. The earliest reference to Satan that you can think of is, in fact, what? The book of Job. And the expression Satan, or the term Satan, which we think of as just utter evil, in fact means what? It means the prosecutor, which is why in the New Testament Satan is called the one who is the accuser of the brethren. He's the accuser. On what basis does he accuse? He points at the law and says, in the court of God, these guys don't keep anything like the right standards for you. And he is our accuser. Jesus is also, in legal terms, is described as what? Our advocate, okay? Now, if I ask for a show of hands, how many of you really relate nicely to lawyers and think they're the greatest heroes of all? Okay, no takers. All right. But Jesus, in one of the many analogies, is called the advocate, the one who speaks for, the one who defends those who are accused. And the reason he defends and is able to offer grace is, well, he is the one who's offered himself for us to pay the penalty. But still, the adversary, the accuser, wants your death. He's calling for the death penalty. Jesus is calling for what? He wants to give you life. Just as one mortgage company just wants to take everything from you. Kind of hope you fail, Bob. Kind of hope you fail. And the other says, now don't fail. Please. You have obligations here, but you know our mortgage is easier. Our requirements are lighter. And we're going to constantly advise you how to stay away from financial death. Because we kind of like to see you succeed. That way we succeed and you succeed. And that's a little bit different than dealing with predators, or even worse, dealing with payday loan. Not that payday loan is Satan, but kind of helps you to think about it a little bit. Now, he goes on to say, you know, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. Anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, and he begins to use a didactic sort of approach. And this is interesting because it's sort of, well, this is what you used to understand. Now I'm going to give you a deeper, broader understanding. This is what somebody said before, but now I'm going to tell you with authority what the reality is. This is not him, if you will, with permission from Moses beginning to say something. He is in fact saying, look, this was then, this is now. That was then, this is now. And in using this technique, which those who study the text will tell you, he is taking a deeper look, a more profound look. This is not just some sort of shallow, try not to kill each other. This is him saying, this is what you need to address. This is the way to life. I'll tell you that anyone who's angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. In fact, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, that's a lot different than saying, just don't kill each other. But you can sort of resent all you like. Don't kill each other, but you can tell each other what you think of each other. Don't kill each other, but just sort of, it's okay to recognize that this person is worthless, a raka. No, this is an approach that is so profound that it doesn't deal with the symptoms of sin. What is the symptom of sin? You're trying to kill each other. It deals with the cause of sin. It deals with the separation between you and God. It deals with your very nature. And your very nature. I remember one old fellow who used to say, human nature, what is it? Equal portions of vanity, jealousy, lust, and greed. Now, when you look in the mirror, do you see vanity, jealousy, lust, and greed? No, you don't necessarily see that. But when you are challenged by Jesus, he said, look, have you killed anyone lately? No, I'm right. Okay, now, look into your soul. Look into the depth of your being, because that's where the problem lies. This is the way you think and feel. It's like, some time ago, we went to Calgary, and my wife's daughter lives there in the house my wife owns, or I should say more correctly, the bank owns, but my wife deals with the bank. Anyway, the smoke detectors are way out of, zone now. So I went out and I bought some smoke detectors and replaced all 3. And if you live in a house, okay, and if you have smoke detectors, yes, you do. All right. Typical smoke detector you used to get for like $15, These days, they've got to speak to you, right, in both official languages, and they've got to detect carbon monoxide, or as we say, monoxide de carbone, all right? That's what you hear. Every time I burn something on the stove, it just beeps. And just to give you a clue, if you take a tea towel and flap it under the smoke detector, it will stop beeping. Of course, you'd never do that, would you? You wouldn't burn anything and you wouldn't set it off, but I've been known to do it. Carbon monoxide, now to all the codes, anybody who builds or anybody who replaces or renovates, you got to go in for these things, and they're going to cost you $50, $60 each. None of these El Cheapo $15 things anymore. And the reason for that is because carbon monoxide is the silent killer. You don't realize it because you're still breathing, all right? You may be asleep, and you're breathing in and you're breathing out. But carbon monoxide, if it gets into your lungs, settles on all those little cells that work out the transfer of oxygen into the bloodstream. And as a result of that, bonds with the atoms or whatever it bonds with. And if carbon monoxide is there, then you can't bring in the oxygen. It blocks the flow. And so it's quite possible for you breathe, but you can't get any benefit from it. And before you know it, you don't even wake up. You just pass out, and you are gone within minutes. You can't breathe. And so if you look at this analogy, it's true. You can be seen to be breathing, seem to be right. You can be seen to function, but you cannot be said to address the root cause of your alienation from God. Well, I haven't killed anyone. Yeah. If you're just breathing away and you're still taking in carbon monoxide, you could say, well, I'm doing all the right things. Yeah. But you're taking in the wrong things, and your body is bonding with the wrong chemicals and the wrong molecules. You're out of luck here. And Jesus says, look, these are the symptoms. You want to kill each other. Let's get down to the cause. In fact, he insists, therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave the gift in front of the altar. Go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to even think that's necessary? Well, you haven't killed anybody, but I tell you, I really don't want you talking to me right now because it doesn't do you any good. You're talking to me, I'm hearing you, but you're not hearing me. The big lesson for you, Bob, is you need to go and settle these things. Settle matters quickly with the person you're at odds with. And they may be taking you to court. Do it while you're still together in the middle of the road. Why? Because your opponent may hand you over to the judge. And the judge may hand you over to the officer. And before you know it, you can be in prison. And you know, it just gets more and more and more complicated, doesn't it? So why don't you stop, and why don't you sort it out right now? And if you come and praying, you better be praying for the strength to go back and sort it out, and not for the strength to just, I want to kill him. Just, Lord, just give me the strength not to do it. No, I want you to have the strength to look into yourself. I think of when I was talking for a while there about the bitter experience of doing something. That was a decade ago. But one benefit I got from building something that didn't sell is I got to be a landlord, which gives me beaucoup examples of interesting situations that had nothing to do with the church. So these are people, you know, when I use an example, you can look around and say, who's he talking about now? Well, I'll tell you, it's not about me. It's not about my wife. It's not about the folks living behind me or beside me here. Not about any of you. But I've met some interesting people over the last decade. I remember one couple, and they were living together, and here they have a daughter, or she has a daughter who lives in the basement as well, and a grandson. And she and her partner had a falling out. Now, he wasn't particularly smart. He went and he had to resolve some things with his ex-wife who, like 10 years ago, they were divorced or something. And so he took off for several days, and they were not getting along well. And so he spent, instead of a couple hours in the lawyer's office to fix something or other, he spent a couple of days at his ex-wife's place. Not very smart. It doesn't matter if you say, well, I slept on the couch or everything. You know, your partner probably doesn't believe you. And so the partner, understandably in some ways, but on the other hand, not necessarily, goes into orbit and contacts me. I want to throw him out. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to change the locks and everything else. And of course, you know, you're talking to somebody who's lived a pretty tough life, been through a couple of relationships, been abused, been let down, is disabled in some way or other now. Things just aren't working. It's obvious things aren't working too well. And it takes three of them together, actually, to pay the rent and get along. But now there's a big blow up. And so I offer some sympathy, some kindness on the phone, and I get a text or so. And I try to be sympathetic. But then, of course, hey, sympathy means must agree. If you agree, then you will obviously support me as I make a power play. And so the next thing I hear is from the party of the first part. And he says, are you going to change the locks? Because she's going to throw everything out in the snow and, you know, all this. Well, no, I really can't do that. I don't want to do that. That's very disruptive, very harmful, very everything. And I tell you, Bob, I didn't do anything that she said. And she said this, and she said that, and she said the other. Well, look, you know, I don't know what to tell you, but if there's going to be violence, you better be prepared to call the police. Parenthetical thought, please don't call me. It's not my job. It's outside of my wheelhouse. It's outside of my universe. I don't want to go, I don't want to travel an hour one way just to stand between two warring people who I can't separate anyway. It's ridiculous for me to get in that situation. In fact, now I'm feeling as though I'm being torn between two people. One asking for understanding and sympathy, the other asking for power, this sort of thing. And so then, of course, the party of the second part demands to know what the party of the first part knows. And it's just escalating. And so I suppose here I am. Now I've been sympathetic to two people. And I know this is going to escalate. And when you get anywhere near a situation like that, just whatever the stink is going to come on you. That's the law of life. And so when I received communication, I wrote email back then to all three parties. The two who were at war, the third party who was standing right there because they all three lived together, And I wrote as tactfully as I could, look, this is what you say, and this is what you say. And I just want to point out that I really don't know all the facts and information. But one thing I do know is that yelling and screaming and threatening is going to force one party or the other to seek out protection. And it's not going to get you anywhere. In fact, there's a third party standing right there, a young woman, and a fourth party, a grandchild. And other parties, neighbors and friends, all of whom you relate to and talk to and everything else. And now, right now, everybody is in fact watching you. And all I can say is either you talk to each other and find some sort of way of understanding why this has gone wrong, or you're going to end up, well, I said, that is the only way I know to find any peace and tranquility in this. I could have added, this is the only way I know to avoid furniture in the snow or in the alley. I'm going to just send your dogs to the pound. I'm going to send your cats to somewhere. I'm going to do this or that or the other thing. All I know is that you need to settle things between yourself before you end up in court. And as adversaries, you find yourself in front of a judge. And a judge hands you one or both of you over to an officer. And one or two of you could well end up in prison. I didn't write all that out. But I made sure that that was part of the sort of implication here. How much further do you want to go with this before you do irreparable damage? And everything went silent after that. And sometime later, I was talking to one of the neighbors, and they said, oh yeah, they were over here. They're all in love again. They're all getting along nicely together. And the only thing I could say was, hey, God, I really didn't want any part of that horrendously dysfunctional situation. On the other hand, I had no choice but to say, no, I really don't want to change locks. And no, I really don't know what you're going to do about this. I really don't want to be, but, you know, if it comes to blows, if it comes to these things, the only recourse I can tell you is that you're going to have to call the police and get protection from this very angry person who wants to throw you out. On and on it went. You know, Jesus, this is exactly what he said. Look, I'll tell you, you will not get out of this situation until you have paid the last penny. Now, there are all sorts of situations in life where we will lose. But I tell you, one sure way to really lose is to just decide that you're going to go to court. And I'm reminded of the old story of the two farmers. Anybody ever hear a story about a farmer? And they got into an argument over the fence line. Well, it should be there. No, you moved it there last night. And back and forth they went. And so they decided, the first one said, I'm going to sue. The second one said, I'm going to sue you. And so the younger farmer, I suppose, walked swiftly into town, went to the lawyer. There was a one-horse town, a one-lawyer town. And he engaged him, and he said, we're going to fight this blankety-blank thing. Okay. Well, a couple hours later, the older farmer shuffles into town, goes to the lawyer and says, look, I want to sue my neighbor. And the lawyer said, I'm sorry, your neighbor got here first. I can't represent you both. And I'm very sorry. I'm sure it'll all be resolved in court, and the judge will take the side of the man who is righteous. Well, I am righteous. You know. And he said, but I'll tell you what. I will give you a letter of recommendation and introduction to the lawyer in the next one-horse town. Oh, thank you. Would you do that favor for me? Sure, I will. So he gives him a sealed envelope. And the old farmer starts walking off to the next town. And partway there, his curiosity gets the better of him, and he pries open the envelope and takes out the letter of introduction from one lawyer to the other. And it reads simply, Dear brother lawyer, here's 2 fat geese. Let's pluck them together. Now, God bless them. There are times when we all need lawyers. In fact, I emailed a lawyer just the other day and got a little bit of advice. And he hasn't billed me yet, but I'm hoping he forgets it was just a 5-minute email. But as you know, all lawyers bill in 6-minute increments, so I don't think I get off for anything. But I did email, and the email that came back said, I recommend you come in and counsel with 3 of us. No way. No way. But I did get a piece of simple clarification of law, and I thought, hey, that's kind of what I was hoping to hear. That solves the problem. At least it gave me a clear direction as to what I was supposed to do about something. But when you get yourself into those situations, Jesus is saying, what are you standing on? You're standing on my pride, my defensiveness, my arrogance, my determination to be just and right in my own eyes, and all of these things. And he is saying to me, look, it's not sufficient that you just don't kill your neighbor. It's sufficient that you go much deeper. You take a much deeper breath, and you get past the silent killer of sin that causes you not to be able to breathe in the breath of life, which is me, the Holy Spirit. And he is saying, you got to think this through, Bob, because in this simple case, you can have a traffic accident, you can get into a brawl in the middle of the white mud freeway, or you can simply exchange information, and you can settle this thing, take a couple of pictures, and move on. And it will be resolved. You want to get in a slugging match because somebody just bumped into your rear? Somebody did that to me about 6 weeks ago. When you get into a slugging match, well, that's not the way I operate. And if you operate that way, eventually you will find you will kill yourself. You may not kill your neighbor, but you kill yourself. You've got to take a deeper breath. You've got to go beyond the simple law of the old covenant and enter into the profound law that is an understanding that I, Jesus, am the definition of the law. To be like me is to be right and to be righteous. As you look at the law and you say, well, okay, this is deeper, this is more profound. Of course, as you come to Jesus, you, as a Sabbatarian, I always ask the question, well, how do you see the explanation in the new covenant of the law that says you rest on the 7th day? What is the application of that, especially since that was a shadow, this is a reality? And in summary, I will give you a perfect example. The law said 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Anybody against rest? Of course not. It's not a bad idea at all. But since Christ is the culmination, the point that the law was aiming for, he is the one who is the ultimate expression of rightness for everyone who believes in him. What was the culmination of that law? And the answer, of course, is the very simple words of Jesus. Come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden. I am your rest. Oh, that's what you mean. That is the profound, final, full expression of all that went before. You are. Yes, exactly. I'm not interested in telling you when you need to sleep. Can't you figure that out for yourself? Well, a lot of times, yeah, but sometimes not. I'm not interested in telling you when that you need a time for break, because, I mean, that varies from person to person, doesn't it? I know I was talking to a young man the other day, and he and his brother are both in business together, and I asked, well, where's your brother? He says he's not working right now. And I realized that the older brother had worked so diligently, we'll use that expression, for the last 10 years, that he was exhausted. He just didn't take any time for recuperation. And so, to put it bluntly, he was having essentially a nervous breakdown, a mental breakdown. He had tried to handle exhaustion with alcohol. He tried to handle exhaustion with distractions. Eventually, it didn't work. He didn't have enough common sense to take a few days of rest now and then. And so between work and the demands of a young, growing family, he suffered collapse. So are human beings foolish that way? Yeah, we are. we won't necessarily take time for rest and recuperation. But that is not what Jesus was ultimately about. The most profound rest you need, he said, is from the labor that you put forth to say that you are right. I am the one who will make you right. And you will find, if you come to me, I am the fulfillment of all that has gone before. I will fulfill all that has gone before, and even I will give you rest. I thought that was a rather piquant example. And it took me a long time to realize that what Jesus was saying to me. You don't need a time and a place, you need a person to lift from you the burden of all the things that plague you and that drag you down, cause you to feel less than you should feel. Since you're my child, and I'm kind of wish that you would feel a full sense of acceptance and fulfillment in your relationship with me. But you don't feel that, do you? No, I don't. Well, that's because maybe you're looking in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. If you look to me, you will find the ultimate fulfillment. So as we look to Jesus, who gives the new covenant, and we say, well, exactly what are you saying? You know, am I free from obligations? No. This new covenant is like going to a better mortgage broker, if you will, but you still are in a covenant. You still have a mortgage, but it's one that's designed to bring you to fullness and completeness and ultimate ownership, not to take your life away. You've entered into a relationship that's not one based on, let's set a few guidelines. So if you just keep this time and place, if you just restrain yourself from killing another person, you address the need to breathe deeply of the life of the Spirit that says, I will address everything that stops me from absorbing the nature of God. The nature of God is life. There are all sorts of things deep within me that say, no, don't want to know that type of life. Because my own vanity, my own jealousy, my own lust, my own greed, my own resentment, and my own desire to be my own man says that I want to be my own God, not you. And you have to accept, I have to accept the one who has offered me freedom to be like him in this new covenant relationship that he is very simply explaining in this Sermon on the Mount. That should be our meditation. And as we think about it this week, and we are perhaps challenged by the question, what am I supposed to be like? What is the law that governs me? The answer should come back to mind. The law that governs me is I should be like him. And I can't imagine him doing what I'm doing right now. And as I think more along those lines, I will find myself being transformed from somebody who thinks, well, as long as I didn't kill anybody this week, I'm doing okay. No, here, I'm being transformed from the inside out to become more like the one who has asked me to enter into a covenant relationship with him. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful that all of the things that you have offered us become plainer and simpler as we look to you and try to understand what it is that you are teaching us in these beautiful statements that you have given through the Sermon on the Mount. As the one who brings the full understanding of what it is our Father in heaven wants of us, we are grateful that you've given us a pattern and an example that we can follow in your footsteps. We can see ourselves becoming more like Jesus, our Savior, understanding that our limitations may be a little different, maybe a little differently directed than before, but still now to the same profound purpose that you have for all of humanity, to become more like your children, and eventually to share everlasting life with you, to enter into that ultimate freedom, which is everlasting life, as opposed to that which the adversary wishes, which is our everlasting death. So we are grateful for that. We ask as we think about it this coming weekend, this coming week, we be transformed just a little bit more in our thinking and our feeling, in our attitude and our approach to all that you set before us. And in this we are grateful and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.